Our next chapter, Learning to Persevere, is a tale of young Alice starting at the bottom rung of the ladder and climbing her way up during her school years. She learned to believe in herself and found friends along the way to support her. Let's get started. The story is called Learning to Persevere. It's based in Greenvale, Victoria, in February 1960. The kitten seemed to like my Vegemite sandwich, which Mum had made for me and brought for me while I was playing outside. I was sitting in the middle of the big white steps leading up to the front door of our house at Greenvale. I sat with the kitten on the middle step, as the little furry thing was so tiny it could not navigate the steps unaided, so I knew I had a captive prisoner. Where was its mother? Probably under our house, I thought, with the rest of the stray kittens. We were often getting stray kittens dumped by the side of the road from people's cars who didn't want them. We lived on the old Sydney Road at Greenvale. Hardly anyone lived where we lived. There were only a few farms in Greenvale, which was 25 kilometres north of Melbourne at the time. The only people who lived there were the farmers like us and the workers who worked on the local farms. Many of the workers or farm hands were former inmates of Pentridge Prison. My grandfather was the local member in the Legislative Assembly of the Victorian Parliament and a member of the parole board for Pentridge Prison in Coburg. He often had a soft spot for the ex-cons, as he called them, and rather, they were ex-prisoners. My grandfather gave them a job, milking his cows and looking after his crops. "What are you doing, Alice? Don't let that cat lick your sandwich." My mother suddenly appeared and interrupted at the top of the steps and said in a scolding manner, "These stray cats have got all sorts of germs and they'll give you worms in your belly. Your cousin Jill got worms from petting the cat and eating food without washing her hands afterwards. It's time we sent you off to school. You're bored at home, and with the new baby coming in November, I haven't got time to keep an eye on you." So that was that. I was going to Greenvale State School. I started school the very next day, with my mother dropping me off with my brothers, who were in grade 2 and grade 4. I was only 3.5, but now I was in prep, going to school. I would turn 4 in April. Greenvale was a tough school. It was a square wooden building consisting of a single room with a movable divider down the middle. Prep to grade 2 were on one side of the large room, and the big kids in grade 3 to 6 were on the other side of the huge dividing wall. They had recently got a second teacher. They used to have only one headmaster for all the kids, but now we had a nice lady teacher for the small ones. Each morning we would line up in 2 rows outside the school building for assembly and sing the national anthem, which was "God Save Our Gracious Queen." Then we would march into school. I was pleased that I was a girl because only the boys got the cuts if they did something wrong. At morning tea or lunch break, when we were all out in the playground, we could hear the cries and screams coming from the headmaster's house just down the paddock from the school. Another unfortunate boy was getting a belting with the cane or the headmaster's belt. I'm not sure which. I never asked how it was done, thinking it's best not to know, and instead I just always did the right thing, whatever that was. At the start of 1961, I went up to grade 1, even though I was still only 4, but would turn 5 in the April of that year. So that's how I ended up being 2 years younger than most of the others in my class. One day, my dad picked me up from school at the end of the day and I ran into his arms and hugged him. Another child in my class came up behind me and said, "Has your dad just got out of jail?" I was so surprised at this. Of course my dad had never been in jail, but I soon realised that he was in the minority of the fathers whose children went to Greenvale State School. Most of the other fathers were either in jail, getting out of jail, or going back into jail. My friend, Susan Scott, lived up the road from us in a tiny wooden house with no front door. It only had those coloured strips that keep the flies out, covering the front entrance. There were only 2 rooms in their house for 8 children. The Scott children had to walk to school each day, which would have been about 2 miles each way. Often when my mother was driving us in the utility truck we owned, or ute as we called it, she would stop and pick them up. They would all pile into the back of the ute, which was uncovered, and they were all unrestrained. My brothers would say, "Do we have to pick up the Scots, Mum? They stink and they never wash." I was sure this was true because I could see no sign of a bathroom when I had visited their house, and Susan definitely didn't know that she was supposed to clean her teeth every day. She hadn't even heard of a toothbrush and paste. I spent one afternoon walking home from school, telling her all about it. Her dad, Harry, had been an inmate at Pentridge. I didn't know what for. I never asked anyone that question. I thought it was rude. Harry worked on my grandfather's farm milking the cows. There was a lot of poverty in the area, and looking back, it must have been very hard for these families to look after their children. My parents owned 10 acres that had been gifted to them from my grandfather as a wedding present, and they started out as egg farmers. My father built our house and a large building further up the paddock to house the chickens. Mum collected and washed the eggs, and then they sold them for income. An economic breakthrough came through for my parents when Dad had the opportunity to be one of 3 partners in a new hardware store in Essendon, which was about 10 miles away or 16 kilometres from Greenvale. I wasn't doing well at Greenvale State School. Some new large pipes had been laid along the side of the road leading up to the school in 1962. The pipes were initially just dumped there by the council for a few months before the work was meant to go ahead to put them underground and make them functional. Apparently, all sorts of hanky-panky was going on inside those pipes between the older boys of the school and the younger kids. I didn't know what was going on, but whatever it was, I wasn't going anywhere near those pipes. Everyone was unsupervised in those days. Kids basically ran wild all afternoon after school finished, until everyone went home to their parents by around 6 p.m, because they were all hungry. "Philip, I want to take Alice away from Greenvale State School," my mother said to my father one day. "It's such a rough crowd of kids, and they get up to all sorts of mischief. I want Alice to get a good education and be a lady. I want her to go to Penley next year. I'll do the books for Northside Hardware and not take a salary if you spend that money to pay for her to go to Penley Ladies College in grade 3. So it was decided. In 1963, at 6 years of age, I started grade 3 at Penley Presbyterian Ladies College in Park Street, Essendon. I was hopeless when I started. The first class of the first day was English, and we began with spelling. The teacher would say a word at the front of the class, and we were all supposed to write that word down. Well, the only spelling I'd done at Greenvale was to draw a picture of the word when the teacher said it. So I did that. I had no idea how to spell a word. As you can guess, I got the lowest mark possible on my first term report for English. I also got the lowest mark possible for maths in grade 3. I remember my mother reading my first report and looking at those pitiful low marks with a sad face. I decided then and there that I would do better each term. I ended up getting the Diligence Prize at the end of grade 3 for the most improved student. This would not have been difficult, I can reflect, considering where my starting point was. One day, when I just turned 7, I fell asleep on the bus going to school. I used to sit at the back of the bus, and so the driver couldn't see me. I woke up and found myself with the bus stopped and parked at the depot. I had forgotten to get out at my stop. Luckily, the driver was still in the bus, and when I declared myself, he very kindly drove the bus back to my school and let me off. I was late for class that day, and assembly had already started. I did have trouble being 2 years younger than most of my peers in primary school. There were a lot of concepts that everyone else seemed to understand and I just didn't. But I can remember feeling the weight of needing to try hard, always do my homework because my parents were giving it their all in the hardware store in Essendon to pay for my tuition. I was going to show them that it was worth it. In grade 6, my parents arranged for me to sit a scholarship exam to go to the neighbouring girls' school, Lowther Hall Church of England Girls' Grammar School, which was also in Essendon. There was 1 full scholarship on offer and 3 half scholarships. This meant the recipient of the full scholarship would have all tuition fees paid for the next 6 years of secondary school. The day came to sit the exam and I did my best, answering the English, maths and general knowledge questions. My parents were delighted when I received one of the half scholarships, so I started at Lowther Hall in Year 7, 1967. At Lowther Hall, I stayed in the maths science academic stream. We could choose this stream or the secretarial stream. While my friends in the secretarial stream were learning typing and shorthand, we in the academic stream were learning languages, maths and science. While we were doing science practical experiments, the other stream was learning domestic science, which was, as I learnt, another name for cooking. In Year 8, we all had formal lessons on manners at the dinner table, how to set the table and where the napkins would go, polite conversation for girls, and also elocution, or how to speak nicely. More accurately, this meant how to speak properly, like the Queen did. We also all did a subject called Mothercraft in Year 8. This subject consisted of learning about the baby's layette, which was another name for the clothes to put on the baby, and appropriate bottles and teats for the baby. I thought it was very strange to be learning mothercraft at 12 years of age. Even though everyone else in the class was 14, none of us was expecting to be having a baby for at least another 15 to 20 years. I thought it's strange that we were being taught how to look after a baby before being given any information as to how babies came to be. How does one get pregnant with a baby, I wondered. The school presented a mother-daughter film night in Year 9, which was optional. I wanted to go to it, but my mother was ambivalent, and I wasn't sure why this was the case. In this film, we saw some animals having babies. I came away from the film night none the wiser about how humans get babies. When I asked my mother about it in the car going home, she said, "We'll talk about that when you're older. You don't need to know anything about that now." Mum and I never had that talk until I had started first year medicine, and I found out about it that way. I had already been having my period since I was 11 years old, but I didn't know how that was related to reproduction exactly until I learnt in my medical course. In Year 9, I started to suspect that I could be getting a better education. I was doing well now, always in the top 25% of my class in maths, science, history, geography, English and languages. My mother had gone to Merton Hall, or Melbourne Girls' Grammar School. She had lived with her family in Preston, where her father, Charlie, had started a boot factory. In early secondary school, she had gone to Preston Girls' High School and done very well academically. Her father's good friend was Dr. Harley. He was a general practitioner and had delivered my mother and her brothers. Charlie and Dr. Harley remained firm friends, and one day, when they were having a beer together, which for Charlie that was frequently enjoyed, Charlie asked old Dr. Harley, "What's the best school I can send Joan to? She's very bright, and I don't see much future for her if she stays at the local high school." "You should send her to Merton Hall, Charlie," replied Dr. Harley. "You can afford that now. The boot factory is going very well for you. It's the best girls' school in Melbourne. It's in South Yarra, Melbourne Church of England Girls' Grammar School." "I loved Merton Hall," Mum told me proudly years later. "I was in the school running team and I made friends with Edna Baker, who was my bridesmaid and lifelong friend. I loved Latin and maths. They were wonderful years of my life that I will never forget." Mum spent her last 3 years of secondary school at Merton Hall from 1939 to 1941. She graduated with honours and prizes for excellence and went on to train at the Royal Melbourne Children's Hospital as a paediatric nurse. "I want to go there," I told Mum one day. "I want to go to the school you went to get the best possible education." I knew it was a stretch for Mum and Dad to send me to Merton Hall. It meant giving up my half scholarship at Lowther Hall. They were both working hard full-time in the hardware store by now to keep their 4 children at private schools. My 2 older brothers were going to Caulfield Grammar, where my father had gone as a boy, and my younger brother was at Essendon Grammar in primary school. In September of 1969, when I am 13 years old, I'm sitting in Miss Mountain's office with my mother being interviewed by Miss Edith Mountain, headmistress of Melbourne Church of England Girls' Grammar School. "I can see Alice has excelled in all her subjects so far in Year 9, or Form 3 as it was known back then. I think she will fit in nicely here at Merton Hall," I heard her say to my mother. January 29, 1970, first day of Year 10, or Form 4 as it was known then, at Merton Hall in South Yarra, Melbourne. "What sports are you going to do here at school, Alice?" one of the girls asked me on my first day. "Well, I'm going to do tennis and hockey, I think," I replied. The girl snickered a little laugh. "Wow, she's gonna do tennis. She's gonna do things," the girl repeated to the other girls in our small circle at lunch. I felt acutely embarrassed, and I could feel my ears burning, and I knew my face was going crimson. From that moment on, for the rest of my life, I wasn't gonna do anything, but I was going to do a lot of things correctly at Merton Hall. And speaking clearly with correct Queen's English would be the first one. I felt so lucky to be at Melbourne Girls' Grammar. The next thing I noticed were the high academic standards expected at the school. My first term reports were very ordinary, and I could see the academic bar had been set way above my previous school. I decided I would need to make a huge effort to get back up to the top 25% of the maths science class I was allocated to. I forgot to do my French homework the first week at my new school. The French teacher asked me to stand up in class and read my homework. I stood up and announced that I had not done it. "This is not a good start for a new student, Alice. You will have to do better than this," the teacher said to me in front of the whole class. Well, as expected, I never failed to complete every scrap of possible homework for every subject after that embarrassment. I had a wonderful experience at Merton Hall for 3 years. In Year 10, we went on a geography trip to New Zealand. It was fabulous, and I made lots of new friends. In Year 11, our class performed the Shakespeare play Macbeth, and I was one of the 3 witches. I joined the school choir and loved every year, the carol service in St. Paul's Cathedral especially. singing Once in Royal David City as our choir processed down the main aisle into the church. I made wonderful lifelong friends like Anne Gossett, who was my bridesmaid, and Carolyn Lone, who went on to become a secondary school principal herself. I decided not to start smoking, even when my holiday friends were smoking. My Merton Hall friends said, "It's just stupid to smoke, so don't do it." I'm thankful to them, as this advice has saved me from lung cancer and emphysema and added years to my life. Most of all, I learnt at Merton Hall to believe in myself. Girls can do anything was something I heard throughout my years at the school. My Year 12 pure maths teacher, Mrs. Pike, believed in me. She told me that she was sure I could get an A for pure maths in matriculation, as they called the VCE in 1972. "You could get into medicine if you wanted to," she told me. I'd never thought I could get the marks good enough to get into medicine when I started Year 12, but my friends thought I could. They told me so, and along with Mrs. Pike, I decided to have a little belief in myself that maybe I could do it, but only if I worked my butt off for all my subjects. Well, I did work my butt off. I worked so hard that I didn't get a period during the whole year. My mother took me to a gynecologist at the end of Year 12 because I'd stopped menstruating 10 months before. The gynecologist could find nothing wrong. After the final exams were over, my periods returned like clockwork. In January 1973, at 16 years of age, I received my final marks and my offer to start medicine at Monash University. I was excited and delighted. I learned that if I have a goal and I work exceptionally hard on it and study, with my friends supporting me, I can achieve that goal. 8 girls in our 1972 Year 12 cohort were accepted into medical school in Melbourne, 1 at Melbourne University and 7 of us at Monash. At our 50-year Old Grammarian anniversary lunch in 2022, all of those girls had had outstanding careers as doctors. It was an enormous pleasure to hear all the tales of amazing professional women who had followed their dreams with grit and determination. They had all been able to do this with the preparation afforded them by their education. Yes, girls can do anything they put their mind to. That's the end of the story. More stories in this series can be found on YouTube at Dr. Diane Leslie Webster, or in my paperback edition of this book entitled 4 Ways to Die at Riverside Towers, available on Amazon and Kindle. Thanks for listening and have a lovely day today.